Before you go to sleep, I want to tell you a story, but not just any story. It's a Jungian story, because it deals with what lives behind the words, with what dwells in the shadows of what you call love. Maybe you've been through something like this. Maybe you're still going through it. Her name was Isabel, and for years, she mistook someone's presence for love. It didn't matter if he was cold, distant, or distracted. All that mattered was that he was there, because deep down, Isabel feared the void more than she feared pain. From a young age, she learned she had to do something to be loved. That love was a response, rather than a state of being. So she did. She did everything. She adapted, she silenced herself, she bent over backwards, until one day, she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. Isabel grew up in a home where silence was interpreted as rejection, where affection only showed up when she met expectations. Her mother, a stern and distant woman, only smiled when Isabel got good grades or acted like a perfect little doll. Her father, a man too busy with his own ghosts, barely looked up from his newspaper when she tried to tell him about her day at school. The house Isabel grew up in had a specific scent, a mix of furniture polish and her mother's expensive perfume. It was a house where everything had its place, where nothing could be out of order. The furniture stayed the same for years, arranged the exact same way. The dining table polished and gleaming, where the family gathered in awkward silences. The living room, with its perfectly placed pillows, where nobody ever really relaxed. Isabel learned to walk on tiptoe in that house, literally and figuratively. Her footsteps were always quiet, her words always measured, her emotions always controlled. She watched the adults around her like a scientist studies rare specimens, trying to decode the secret formula that would make her worthy of love. Her mother, Clara, had grown up in an era when appearances mattered more than feelings. She came from a traditional family and learned that showing emotion was a sign of weakness, that children should be seen, not heard, that love was shown through practical care, clean clothes, food on the table, homework checked, never through spontaneous hugs or kind words. Clara loved Isabel in her own way, but it was a strict love, full of conditions. When Isabel came home crying because a classmate had been mean, Clara didn't console her. Instead, she'd say things like, "Stop crying. You need to make them respect you." When Isabel showed her colorful, cheerful drawings, Clara would critique them with a discerning eye. "You could have put more effort into this part here." Isabel's father, Fernando, was a kind man who had given up fighting the family system a long time ago. He worked as an accountant at a small firm and always came home exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. He had learned that it was easier to hide behind his newspaper than to face his wife's silent demands and his daughter's hopeful gaze. Sometimes when Clara wasn't around, Fernando looked at Isabel with a tenderness she noticed but couldn't name. These moments were fleeting, a smile when she told a joke, a gentle pat on her head as he passed by. But they were rare and secret, as if showing affection was a dangerous transgression. So Isabel learned how to dance. Not real dancing, but that subtle, constant dance of someone who's always trying to please. She memorized the preferences of every important person in her life. She knew when to speak and when to be quiet, when to smile and when to fake sadness, when to be strong and when to show just enough vulnerability. Not too much so as not to bother anyone and not too little so as not to seem cold. At school, Isabel was the model student. Always on time, always prepared, always polite. Teachers praised her constantly, and she became addicted to their approval. It was like a drug. Each compliment made her feel alive, and each criticism made her feel invisible. She studied obsessively, not for love of knowledge, but because high grades could make her mother genuinely smile. During recess, Isabel watched other kids playing and laughing loudly, and she felt a strange envy. They seemed so free, so effortless, so naturally themselves. Isabel wished she could be like that, but didn't know how. Every time she tried to let go, an internal voice reminded her that she should behave better, study more, be more perfect. She had one friend at school, Carla, who was everything Isabel secretly wanted to be. Carla laughed out loud, said what was on her mind, argued with her parents when she disagreed with them. Isabel admired her and envied her at the same time. Carla seemed to have a natural right to exist that Isabel had never felt she had. One day, Carla asked Isabel, "Why do you never get mad? Why do you never say what you really think?" Isabel had no answer. She didn't know what she really thought. She'd spent so long trying to think what others wanted to hear that she'd lost touch with her own opinions. As a teenager, Isabel fell in love for the first time. Pedro was a shy boy in her class who hardly looked her in the eye. She spent months studying his every move, preference and word. She changed the way she dressed, started liking the music he liked, pretended to be interested in the books he read. When she finally got his attention, she felt victorious. But the victory was short-lived. Pedro soon became interested in another girl, one who seemed more authentic, more herself. That girl's name was Anna. Anna was in many ways the opposite of Isabel. She wore clothes she actually liked, not necessarily fashionable ones. She talked about subjects that interested her, even if nobody else cared. She openly disagreed when someone said something she opposed, and Pedro was fascinated by that authenticity. Isabel watched Anna from a distance, trying to figure out her secret. How could she be so relaxed? How could she not care about other people's approval? How could she just be? Isabel tried to imitate Anna for a few weeks, but it came across as forced, fake. People noticed something was off, and Isabel soon returned to her old ways. Pedro's rejection hurt more than it should have, because it confirmed her biggest fear. She wasn't enough just by being herself. There was something wrong with who she really was, some fundamental flaw she had to hide at all costs. Isabel couldn't understand. How could someone choose a person who wasn't trying so hard? How could anyone pick someone who didn't completely conform to what was expected? These questions tortured her for many sleepless nights. She stared at her reflection, trying to figure out what was wrong with her, what flaw Anna didn't have. Years passed, and Isabel perfected her craft. In college, at work, in relationships, she was always the perfect person for every situation. With her studious friends, she was intellectual. With partygoers, she was fun. With sensitive types, she was understanding. With pragmatic types, she was objective. She had a version of herself for each person she met. In college, Isabel studied psychology. Ironically, she chose that field because she wanted to understand people, to discover the secrets of human connection that always eluded her. But even there, she became the exemplary student, always with the right answers, never questioning the professors, writing the most organized and well-structured papers. In her classes on human development, Isabel learned about attachment and the importance of unconditional love in shaping one's personality. She read about children who grew up confident because they knew they were loved regardless of their behavior, and she felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Envy, sadness, anger. Isabel had several relationships during college, all following the same pattern. She became exactly what each boyfriend needed. With Diego, who was an artist, she pretended to understand abstract art and spent hours in galleries that bored her. With Marcos, who was athletic, she started running and going to the gym, even though she hated working out. With Andre, who was an intellectual, she read philosophy books that didn't genuinely interest her. Each relationship lasted a few months until the boyfriends sensed that something was missing. They couldn't quite put their finger on it, but there was a feeling of emptiness, as if they were dating a shadow instead of a real person. Isabel interpreted these breakups as confirmation that she needed to try even harder. It was in a lecture on Jung that Isabel first heard about the concept of the persona, the mask we wear to present ourselves to the world. The professor explained how sometimes people become so identified with their personas that they lose touch with who they really are. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if someone were describing her entire life. But even that revelation wasn't enough to make her change. It was easier to keep clinging to familiar patterns than to face the terror of the unknown. After all, who was she without her personas? What would remain if she took off all her masks? After college, Isabel got a job at a psychology clinic. Once again, she became the ideal employee, punctual, dedicated, always willing to work overtime. Her colleagues respected her, but there was always a certain distance. She joined in work-related conversations, but whenever things got personal, she withdrew. Around this time, Isabel met Ricardo. He was a therapist at another clinic, and they met at a psychology conference. Ricardo was everything she believed she should want: successful, good-looking, admired by peers. He spoke with authority about therapy, quoted renowned authors, and had a presence that commanded respect. When she met Ricardo, Isabel thought she'd found her big chance at happiness. He was everything she thought she should want: successful, handsome, admired by everyone. And so she became exactly what he needed. When he talked about work, she listened intently, memorizing every detail to ask smart questions later. When he wanted to go out with friends, she smiled and said she didn't mind, even though her chest felt tight. When he was stressed, she became his silent safe haven, holding back her own worries so as not to burden him. Ricardo loved talking about his cases, without breaking confidentiality, of course, his theories and the books he was reading. Isabel became his perfect audience. She bought every book he mentioned, studied the theories he discussed, and asked clever questions that made him feel important and valued. For the first few months, Ricardo was smitten. He told his friends he'd found a woman who truly understood him and shared his intellectual interests. Isabel felt triumphant. She'd finally found the right formula, the version of herself that worked. They moved in together after 8 months. Isabel moved into Ricardo's modern, minimalist apartment that reflected his personality. She stored her own things, romance novels she liked to read, the plants she collected, the colorful paintings that made her smile, in a corner of the closet. The apartment had to reflect Ricardo's taste, not hers. Isabel learned to cook his favorite dishes, even though she didn't enjoy cooking. She watched the documentaries he chose, even though she preferred romantic comedies. She went to the social events he attended, even if she felt out of place among his academic colleagues. For 2 years, Isabel kept up this performance. She was the perfect girlfriend, smart enough to keep up with him, but not so smart that she competed. Affectionate enough to make him feel loved, but not so needy that she annoyed him. Independent enough not to be a burden, but not so independent that she didn't need him. Isabel didn't realize that what she called love was really just the fear of being left, the fear of not being enough, the fear of facing the silence of her own company. Jung called this an emotional shadow, the thing we refuse to see, yet that drives everything we do. Isabel projected this fear onto everyone else. She thought they were rejecting her when in reality, she was the one who abandoned herself the most. Isabel's shadow consisted of all the aspects of herself she deemed unacceptable: her need for attention, her anger when she didn't feel valued, her envy of people who seemed more authentic, her desire to truly be seen and known. All of it was buried so deeply, she didn't even recognize it as part of herself. Instead, she projected these traits onto others. When she saw a woman being dramatic or needy, she felt an inexplicable contempt. When she saw someone openly expressing anger, she felt uncomfortable and labeled them unbalanced. When she saw people who seemed unconcerned about others' opinions, she thought they were selfish or insensitive. What Isabel didn't realize was that everything that bothered her about others were actually parts of herself she had rejected. Her shadow was trying to speak to her through these projections, but she was determined not to listen. Meanwhile, Ricardo was starting to sense something was off in the relationship. Early on, he'd been enthralled by their apparent compatibility, but over time, he felt something was missing. It was as if Isabel was too perfect, as though she had no rough edges or flaws that made her real. He tried talking to her about it a few times indirectly. He asked what she truly thought about certain topics, tried to spark debates, looked for moments of disagreement that might reveal who she really was. But Isabel always agreed with him or disagreed so politely and carefully that it felt rehearsed. Ricardo began to feel like he was in a relationship with a very polite mirror. Isabel simply reflected his own opinions, interests, and preferences back at him. It was comfortable but empty. He missed being surprised, challenged, caught off guard. There was an older therapist at Ricardo's clinic named Dr. Helena. She noticed he hadn't seemed like himself lately, more distant, less enthusiastic. Over coffee one day, she asked how things were going in his relationship. "Fine," Ricardo answered automatically, then paused. "Actually, I'm not sure. Isabel is wonderful. She's everything I always thought I wanted in a partner. But, Dr. Helena prompted gently, "sometimes I feel like I don't really know her. Like she's always playing a role, always trying to be perfect for me. And it makes me wonder if I'm really in love with her, or just with the idea of her." Dr. Helena nodded sympathetically. "Have you tried talking to her about it? How can I complain that someone is too perfect? It sounds ridiculous even to me." Ricardo began distancing himself slowly, almost imperceptibly. First it was the texts that took him longer to answer. Then the cancelled plans at the last minute. Then weekends he preferred to spend alone or with friends. The silences that stretched through dinner. He wasn't doing it on purpose to hurt Isabel. He wasn't even fully aware of it. It was as if his unconscious was trying to create some breathing room in a relationship that paradoxically suffocated him with its perfection. Isabel reacted as she always did, by stepping up her efforts. She cooked his favorite meals, bought tickets to shows he'd casually mentioned, dressed the way he liked. When that didn't work, she tried giving him more space, thinking maybe she was smothering him. When that also failed, she went back to being more present, more attentive, more available. She started closely monitoring every shift in Ricardo's mood, every tiny change in his tone of voice, every sign of distraction. She developed a hypersensitive radar for detecting any discontent, trying to fix it before he even noticed it himself. When Ricardo came home tired from work, Isabel already had his favorite tea prepared and relaxing music playing. If he seemed worried, she'd ask careful questions and offer helpful suggestions. If he was stressed, she'd become almost invisible, handling all the practical details around the house so he wouldn't have to worry about a thing. It was like she was in a frantic dance, trying to find the perfect step, the perfect rhythm that would make Ricardo look at her with the same admiration he'd had in the beginning. But the more she danced, the more he pulled away. The more she tried to be perfect, the more imperfect she felt. Isabel started having insomnia. She lay awake for hours, analyzing every interaction, every word exchanged, every facial expression Ricardo made. What did she do wrong? What could she do differently? She made mental lists of improvements she could implement, strategies she could try. By day, Isabel was on autopilot. At work, she was still the exemplary professional, but her co-workers began noticing she seemed more tense, more distant. She turned down invitations to happy hour, saying she needed to get home to Ricardo. In truth, she needed to get home so she could continue her constant vigilance over the relationship. Isabel's friends, the few she still kept in touch with, told her she should break up with him, that it was obvious Ricardo wasn't interested anymore, that she deserved someone who valued her, but Isabel couldn't hear them. For her, breaking up meant admitting she had failed, that she wasn't good enough, that after so much effort, she still couldn't be loved. "You're not happy," her friend Carla said during a rare lunch they had together. "When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" Isabel didn't answer. She couldn't remember. "And when was the last time you disagreed with him about anything? Said something that was really your own opinion?" Again, silence. "Isabel, do you even know who you are when you're not trying to be perfect for someone else?" Carla's question echoed in Isabel's mind for days. Who was she really? If she took off all the personas, all the adaptations, all the performances, what would be left? Yet she carried on pretending not to see the signs, carried on making plans for their future, talking about trips they'd never take, about the house they'd never buy together, carried on bending, adapting, and diminishing herself, hoping he'd eventually notice her again. Isabel started reading books on relationships, searching for articles online about how to rekindle your partner's interest. She tried every technique she found, gave him more space, then got closer, tried being more independent, then more affectionate, tried being mysterious, then more open. She'd test each strategy for a few weeks before swapping it for a new one. She began fantasizing about a future where everything went back to normal, where Ricardo would look at her again like he did at the start, where they'd make plans together again, where she would finally have cracked the code for lasting love. These fantasies became a refuge from the increasingly obvious reality. The truth was, Isabel was so afraid of being alone that she'd rather be with someone who wasn't really there, so afraid of silence that she clung to empty conversations, so afraid of rejection that she rejected herself first, hiding who she truly was before anyone else could dislike her. Her fear of being alone was something she'd carried since childhood. It was a visceral, primal fear, as if she'd die if she found herself truly alone. Not physically alone, she could handle being alone in the apartment, but emotionally alone, without someone to validate her existence, importance, worth. Isabel had learned very early that existing without someone else's gaze was like not existing at all. She needed others' attention to feel real, to feel alive. And the idea of losing that gaze, of becoming invisible, terrified her more than anything. One day he left, and she thought she would collapse. But nothing happened. The world didn't end. The ground didn't vanish beneath her. What fell apart was the illusion. For the first time, Isabel was truly alone. Whole. Scared, yes, but whole. Ricardo didn't give a dramatic speech. There were no shouts or accusations. He simply said he wasn't happy, that he felt they'd lost their connection, that he needed some time. He said it casually, as they were talking about what to watch on TV, as if commenting on the weather. "I don't understand what happened," he said, staring at his hands. "You're wonderful, Isabel. You're everything any man could want. But I feel like I don't really know you at all, like you're this very polite ghost." Isabel felt as if the floor had opened beneath her. "But I'm exactly what you want me to be," she said, and immediately realized how that sounded. "Exactly," Ricardo replied sadly. "That's the problem. All her strategies, her tireless effort, her constant dedication, none of it was enough. She tried to reason with him, negotiate, promised she could change, could do better. But Ricardo had already been gone emotionally for a while. "I don't want you to change for me," he said. "I want you to just be yourself. But I don't know who that is, and I suspect you don't either." His words cut through Isabel like arrows because they were true. In the first days after he left, Isabel braced herself for despair. She expected a deep depression, the sense that her life was over. She thought she'd be unable to get out of bed, to eat, to function. That's how she always imagined losing someone so important would feel. But it didn't happen. She woke up and the apartment was quiet, but not terrifyingly empty. She made coffee just for herself, and it didn't feel tragic. She watched the kind of movies Ricardo hated and realized she liked them more than she'd admitted. Isabel spent the first few days in a kind of haze. She walked around the apartment as if in a dream, touching objects, noticing spaces, as if seeing them for the first time. Without the constant need to read Ricardo's moods, anticipate his needs, adjust her own behavior, she felt strangely empty. But it wasn't the kind of emptiness she'd always feared. It was more like a blank space on a sheet of paper, an absence, yes, but also a possibility. One morning, Isabel woke up craving pancakes, not because Ricardo liked them, but because she did. It was such a foreign feeling that she stood in the kitchen for several minutes, trying to recall the last time she'd had a desire of her own, unfiltered by what someone else might prefer. She made the pancakes, and they were delicious. Slowly, Isabel realized how many parts of herself she'd abandoned during those years with Ricardo. She'd stopped reading the books she liked because he thought they were silly. She'd let go of friends he considered too dramatic. She'd shelved hobbies that didn't impress anyone, ignored dreams that seemed too small to matter. Isabel found a box in the back of the closet full of her belongings from when she moved into Ricardo's apartment. Simple things: an old diary, photos, letters from friends, small souvenirs from trips. She spent hours examining these items like archaeological artifacts from a lost civilization. In her diary, she found notes from a version of Isabel she'd forgotten existed. A girl who wrote bad but heartfelt poems. A girl who cared about environmental issues and dreamed of volunteering at a non-profit. A girl who wanted to learn guitar, travel to Europe alone, get a dog. Who was this person, she asked aloud. Then came an even scarier question. Does she still exist? Over time, she started doing small things for herself, cooking for herself, reading in silence, feeling the weight of an empty home and not running away from it. And it was in that silence that she heard a long-forgotten voice, her own. Isabel discovered she liked getting up early and having coffee on the balcony, watching the city come to life. That was something she never did with Ricardo, who liked to sleep in on weekends. She discovered she enjoyed the slow ritual of making coffee, breathing in its aroma as it spread through the house, watching people down on the street. She realized she had strong opinions about politics, art, and life. Opinions she'd silenced for so long, she'd almost forgotten she had them. She started watching the news and found herself yelling at the TV when some politician said something that infuriated her. It felt strange to hear her own voice expressing indignation, passion, conviction. She discovered she laughed too loudly, cried easily at sappy movies, loved dancing around the house alone when nobody was watching. All aspects of herself she'd repressed because they didn't fit the sophisticated and controlled woman image she thought she needed to project. Isabel began to experiment. She bought clothes she actually liked, not the ones the magazines insisted looked good on her. She redecorated the apartment with colors that made her smile, even if they weren't elegant. She started cooking dishes she felt like eating, even if they were too simple. She reconnected with friends she'd neglected. At first, she felt guilty, like she didn't deserve their warmth after putting them second for so long. But they welcomed her with open arms, and Isabel realized that real friendships survive breaks, mistakes, and tough phases. Carla was especially understanding. "I knew you were losing yourself," she said one night over dinner, "but I also knew you had to figure it out on your own. Nobody could show you who you were, you had to remember." "What if I can't?" Isabel asked. "What if I forget who I am again?" "Then you'll remember again," Carla said simply. "As many times as it takes." Isabel started therapy, not because she was broken and needed fixing, but because she wanted to understand how she'd gotten to this point. She wanted to figure out why she'd spent so long running from herself. In her sessions, she talked about the child she once was, the fears she carried, the patterns she kept repeating without even noticing. Her therapist, Dr. Marina, was a woman in her 50s with a warm but direct manner. She didn't offer quick fixes or simplistic advice. Instead, she asked questions that forced Isabel to examine herself from angles she'd never considered. "When you were a child," Dr. Marina asked in one of their earliest sessions, "how did your parents react when you showed strong emotions?" Isabel thought for a long moment. "They didn't react well. My mom would say I was being dramatic. My dad would just walk away. And what did you learn from that? That my emotions were inconvenient, that I should control them better. And now as an adult, how do you feel about your own emotions?" Isabel realized she still felt compelled to stifle any feeling she deemed too much. Anger, deep sadness, euphoria, anything outside the realm of appropriate emotions embarrassed her. Isabel discovered that her constant need for approval was rooted in an old wound, the sense that she wasn't lovable simply by being herself. She realized she'd confused love with dependence, caring with control, intimacy with fusion. She realized she'd outsourced her self-esteem, handing other people the power to make her feel worthy. "You spent so much time trying to be who others wanted," Dr. Marina observed, "that you forgot to figure out who you actually want to be." "But what if I find out and don't like it?" Isabel asked. "What if I discover I'm actually not that interesting or special?" "That might be a possibility," the therapist admitted. "But think of it this way. Even if you find out you're fairly ordinary, at least you'll be an authentic, ordinary person. And that's already extraordinary." Slowly, Isabel began relating to herself differently. She stopped criticizing herself for past mistakes and started viewing them as part of her learning process. She stopped demanding perfection from herself and began accepting her own contradictions, flaws, and quirks. Isabel created a self-compassion ritual. Every time she caught herself being overly critical, she would pause and ask, "What would I say to a friend going through the same situation?" She invariably realized she'd be far kinder and more understanding to a friend than she was to herself. She learned to be alone without feeling abandoned. She learned to make decisions based on what she truly wanted, not on what she thought others expected. She learned that she could be loved without sacrificing herself, that she could care for someone without erasing herself, that she could be vulnerable without being a hostage to someone else's approval. It wasn't a linear process. There were days when Isabel felt strong and confident in her newly discovered authenticity, and there were days when loneliness weighed on her chest like a rock, days when she questioned whether the journey of self-discovery was worth it. Isabel didn't become strong overnight, but she learned that love isn't about someone else staying. Love is when you don't walk away from yourself. That realization came gradually, in small moments of clarity. One day she noticed she'd spent an entire afternoon without caring what anyone thought of her. Another day, she disagreed with someone in a work meeting, and instead of feeling anxious, she felt alive. Of course, there were moments of relapse, moments when she caught herself trying to impress someone new, feeling the old anxiety of not being enough. But now she recognized those moments. She could pause, take a deep breath, and ask herself, what do I truly want here? Am I acting out of love or out of fear? Isabel started relating to people differently, not as someone desperate for validation, but as someone who genuinely had something to offer. Not by hiding her opinions and preferences, but by sharing them and staying curious about the other person's reaction. Not by completely molding herself to others, but by seeking genuine points of connection. When meeting new people, Isabel would introduce herself as she really was, not as she thought she should be. She talked about her real interests, true passions, and honest vulnerabilities, and she discovered something surprising. People connected more deeply with her authenticity than they ever had with her performances. There was a new psychologist at work named Gabriel who started showing interest in her. But this time, Isabel didn't switch to her old adaptation mode. Instead, she watched her own reactions, her own feelings before worrying about how to please him. Gabriel was different from Ricardo in many ways. He seemed genuinely curious about what she thought, not just looking for an echo chamber. When she disagreed with him, he got excited, like the disagreement was a chance to learn something new. "You're interesting," he said, after a spirited debate on different therapeutic approaches. "You have your own ideas." Isabel laughed. "You say that like it's a surprise." "To me it is," he admitted. "Most people I know seem more eager to agree with me than to have a real conversation." Isabel realized she had a choice. She could revert to her old habits, studying everything about Gabriel to become his perfect partner. Or she could keep being herself and see what happened. She chose to keep being herself. Isabel learned that loneliness and being alone are completely different things. Loneliness is when you're cut off from yourself, even if you're surrounded by people. Being alone is when you're in your own company, whole and present. And she discovered she actually liked her own company. She created rituals just for herself. Sunday mornings became sacred. Slow coffee on the balcony, a book in her hand. No hurry to be anywhere. She made a little corner in her apartment just for her, with her plants, her books, her favorite photos. She started traveling solo, exploring places at her own pace, striking up conversations with strangers without worrying about impressing anyone. On a solo trip to a small town, Isabel had a revelation. She was sitting in a square, people watching, when she realized she felt completely at ease for the first time in a long time. There was no one to impress, no role to play, no expectations to meet. Just her, fully present in the moment, connected to herself. So this is what it feels like to be at home, she thought. It's not a place, it's a state of being. Isabel realized she had spent so long trying to be the right person for everyone else that she'd forgotten to find out who she really was. And that discovery wasn't dramatic or epic. It was gentle, everyday, built from small moments of recognition. Oh, so I like this. So this is really how I feel. So this is what I'm like when I'm not pretending. Over time, Isabel started attracting different kinds of people. People interested in who she truly was, not who she pretended to be. People who didn't need her to shrink herself for them to feel significant. People who celebrated her unique traits instead of trying to mold her to their expectations. Sometimes she still thought of Ricardo, but without resentment or longing. She thought of him with a strange gratitude, because losing him led her to find herself. If he hadn't left, she might never have stopped running from who she really was. During a conversation with Carla, Isabel reflected, "It's ironic. I spent so much time trying to be perfect for Ricardo that I forgot to be real. And in the end, that very lack of authenticity is what drove him away." "If you two met again today," Carla asked, "do you think it would be different?" Isabel thought for a moment. "Maybe, but I'm not sure we'd be compatible. Now I know who I am, and we might discover we just don't fit. And that would be okay." Isabel understood that the love she'd so desperately sought from others was inside her all along. Not narcissistic or selfish love, but a solid, trustworthy love that didn't depend on external validation to exist. A love that would always be there, no matter who came or went from her life. Years later, Isabel looked back and recognized the woman she had been, but not with shame or regret. She understood that her entire journey, including years of self-abandonment, the painful relationship with Ricardo, and the terrifying loneliness, had been necessary for her to get where she was. "I had to lose myself in order to find myself," she wrote in her journal. "I had to feel the emptiness of self-abandonment to appreciate the fullness of being true to who I am." She still had moments of insecurity, hard days, doubts, but now she faced them as her own friend, not her enemy. When fear arose, she welcomed it. When anger showed up, she honored it. When sadness came, she let it be. "The difference," she said in a therapy session, "is that before I was afraid of my own feelings. Now I see them as valuable information about my inner experience." If you ever feel you have to try too hard to be loved, maybe it's time to ask yourself, is it love, or is it fear of being alone? Good night. May you sleep, not to escape pain, but to rest from the effort of being what others expect. If this story resonated with something inside you, comment, "I deserve to stay with myself." That way I'll know you felt it. Leave a like if this touched you. And if you want to keep journeying within, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting for you.